Hello and welcome to my reading of The Co-Ed Killer. Throughout the 1900s, the United States had gone through many serial killers' investigations and cold cases to set an example of the sick-minded. However, none were as sick and mentally unstable as the Co-Ed Killer. Edmund Kemper was a towering force to be reckoned with a taste for blood and lust. The only thing differentiating this serial killer from most is that he actually turned himself in. But why? That's what we're going to find out today. So first, we're going to go through his motives/reasoning behind the killings. For a man like Edmund Kemper, you wouldn't think someone like him to be capable of the things he said he felt capable of doing. However, many called him a big friendly giant, showing the ease he had when carrying out his crimes on unsuspecting victims. During this time, there were not many precautions at most campus settings for the lack of knowledge and resources. This very fact made it easier for people like Edmund at the time to kidnap victims and get away with it, especially with how many cases were popping up around the globe at the time, like the Zodiac Killer. Unlike the Zodiac Killer, however, Edmund would eventually be caught, quote unquote, after multiple killings so that he may plead guilty in court and say his mother was the cause for his bloodlust. We're going to go on to his childhood. His father, Edmund Jr., was honorably discharged after World War II when he fought for the Special Forces. He was after an electrician, but his wife was unhappy with his new profession after the war. When Ed was 6 years old, his father left for research on the atom bomb, and his mother became bitter. Edmund remarks, "My mother had a very strong and violently outspoken position on men. My mother was sick, angry, hungry, and a very sad woman. I hated her, but I wanted to love my mother." As his father did typical fatherly things at the time, like playing cards and having beer with the boys, the mother viewed this as a patriarchal abuse of power. Referring back to Edmund's account for his mother, Edmund viewed this attribute of her outspoken opinions of the world as a toxic hatred for men that fueled Edmund's own violence at a young age. Edmund was not allowed near his family for he seemed to be very violent at his young age, quoted by his mother. However, in Edmund's eyes, this was another fact that his mother never loved him, and this is what drove him to insanity in the end. It was thought Clarnell Kemper had borderline personality disorder for the way she felt victimized by everything her husband did. However, this was a post-mortem diagnosis that entirely depended on Edmund's depiction of her in later interviews. However, this is explained by her treatment of her family. There were even reports that his mother would berate and force Edmund to sell newspapers, and he wasn't allowed home until he sold all of the papers. This is when his father would come home to find Edmund piled up next to the stack of newspapers after searching for him when he got home from work. Edmund had two sisters, and Susan, the oldest of the three, would even go as far as mimicking the bereavement his mother took upon him and quote unquote molested him as a young boy. Similarly, when Ed was 10, on a trip to New York, he was molested by a male cousin. It seems as though sexual abuse is prominent in Ed's childhood. Ed's mother separated him from his older siblings, forcing him to reside in the basement. In 1958, his father came home to find the terrible living conditions as Ed was living in a rat-infested basement. During this time, Edmund began to kill house cats and at one point shot a dog to, quote, see what it felt like. Classic serial killer quote. After a tough divorce in September 1961, when Ed was only 12 years old and a late marriage his mother had with Norman Turnquist, his father would then move on to California to live with his father. Here's a note that I added. Edmund hated Norman and would fantasize killing him, but scared of his retaliation since he was a much larger man, even though Ed would go on to grow to be 6'4". So Edmund begged his father to stay with him, and eventually he said yes, but because of Ed's rising hostility and menacing behavior to others, and Ed's inability to maintain healthy relationships, especially with women, because of Ed's rising hostility and menacing behavior to others and inability to maintain healthy relationships, especially with women, his father sent Ed to live with his grandparents, making him feel even more rejected and furthermore betrayed by his family. Note, he would stare at his father's second wife while naked in her bedroom. Ed said he would do this on purpose in later interviews as it was a quote, come on. Okay. Instead of having a father-son talk like, hey Ed, you're a little weird, and like he ended up sending his son to live with his grandparents. Like he could have like had like a whole Dexter thing where like, oh, like you're a psychopath, you're a serial killer, but like you should use your powers for good. Use your evil for good instead. Like use your serial killer aspects to hunt down other serial killers. Like I mean, they did end up catching because later on you'll see he was in Mindhunters. Uh, he turned himself in, and the FBI wanted to see what a serial killer's mind would be to help solve crimes. I'm getting far into it. Let's talk about his crimes. Clarnell was quoted saying to Ed Sr., "You're taking a huge chance leaving him with your parents. You might be surprised to wake up some morning to learn they have been killed." This is when, in Nevada, while living on a 7-acre quiet ranch, Edmund Kemper would begin his killing spree. Whilst living among Edmund Sr., who had been suffering from late-stage dementia at the time, and his grandmother, who had seemed to also follow in the hate for patriarchy as his mother did, Big Ed found this to be a perfect time to kill his grandmother without anyone finding out. And so, when his grandfather left home to go grocery shopping on the 26th of August in 1964, while Edmund was proofreading his grandmother's latest children's book in the kitchen, Maud Kemper felt a pair of eyes peering at her from across the table. When she looked up, she saw Edmund staring directly at her without remorse. When she told him to stop, he stood up and took his rifle and said he was going hunting. As the minute passed, she began to feel a little better now that Edmund was gone, until he quietly stepped right back inside from the porch and shot her in the back of the head and twice more in the back. This is when Edmund's grandfather came home and began to unload groceries. In fear of what Edmund Sr.'s reaction might be, and some kind of crazed justification of what he would do upon the sight of his dead wife, Big Ed shoots Edmund Sr. in the back of the head in the middle of the driveway. And it would be many days before an investigation would start because of the location. Big Ed would then confess to his mother that he quote-unquote accidentally killed them, but she saw right through this, and he later admitted to the police, quote, "I just wondered how it would feel to shoot Grandma." Because of his 15 years of age in 1964, he was sentenced to a juvenile detention center. The California Youth Authority labeled him to be a paranoid schizophrenic, which would excuse his crimes as an act of insanity, and so he was sent to the Atascadero State Hospital for psychiatric treatment. Court psychiatrists concluded he was, quote, psychotic at the time of the murders, confused and unable to function. He has paranoid ideation, growing more and more bizarre. It is noteworthy that he is more paranoid towards women, all except his mother, who is the real culprit. This furthermore concluded that his actions were because of his abuse as a young child. However, stating that he was psychotic at the time of the murders denies the possibility of a reasonable sentence for someone as evil as Ed Kemper, giving him a chance to go on to become the co-ed killer. Even with the diagnosis, there were still discrepancies stating that he showcased no flight of ideas, no interference with thought, no expressions of delusion or hallucinations, and no evidence of bizarre thinking. And so this was later chalked up to be trauma from prolonged abuse from his mother, housing for a specific passive-aggressive personality trait disturbance within Kemper, implying he has a personality disorder of some kind instead. Nevertheless, his current state of mental health is unsafe for those around him, and he should have been locked up for longer. Now starts the co-ed killings. Ed did his best when he got out of the hospital, though it was advised that he should not stay with Clarnell because she would be a trigger for his hostile actions. The CYA set him up to live with his mother despite these warnings. This is when Ed began to follow political anti-hippie movements, and like the police specifically who he had seen enforcing anti-hippie movements with force at the time. However, because of Big Ed's record, he was not allowed to be an acting officer, but they accepted him into jury rooms. During his close encounters with the law officers, he swapped numbers with cops and would go out for drinks with officers to talk about cases. This was around the time he got the name Big Ed and became a good friend of the police force. He was also compelled by parole requirements to attend the local community college. Clarnell would pay Ed surprise visits while he attended this college, and so he says he backslid because of this. This is when he felt drawn back to his mother, saying he couldn't afford to pay for rent anymore at college, but this was a lie because he felt he was manipulated to strengthen his relationship with his mother at home. This, of course, was an act of self-sabotage in retrospect. Ed's mother worked at Stevenson's College, and Ed began to work as a California highway patrolman during this time. During one of his patrols, a female driver had stricken him on the highway, and he later sued for emotional and physical damages. This, however, would be the catalyst for his future killings. It did not help that the driver was female and the victim was Edmund Kemper. Now that Edmund had a new car from the lawsuit, new fueled rage, and his seemingly never-ending arguments with his mother every time she came home from work, Big Ed would begin to drive around to pick up hitchhikers to test his impulses. Edmund became unhinged at this point, buying guns and other resources to put into his car to make his habits even more evil and unsafe for both him and the people hitching for a ride. Each time he would do this, he would get closer and closer to these women, getting better at luring and closer to killing, until eventually he would allow for his compulsions to take over, and he would kill unsuspecting students looking for a ride. These girls knew he was unsettling, however, at the time, there were no such thing as co-ed killers, looking for unsuspecting girls hitching for a ride. It also didn't help that Ed meticulously put a staff parking sticker on his car, since his mother worked at the nearby university, to put these girls at ease as news came out that hitchhiking was no longer safe in the Santa Cruz area. When Edmund would pick up these young women, he would eventually follow through with these fantasies of killing. He once stopped for gas and began to trick the naive girls, making them think he was a police officer or some kind of authority figure, so that they felt more entrusted with him. All this to furthermore put their guards down. He knew how much power he had over the situation he had created. He then found a cul-de-sac, pulled out a 9mm handgun from under the car seat, and forced them to engage in sexual acts with each other. Marianne, aged 18, begged for him to let them go, and that they'd follow through with whatever he had asked, as long as they were free to go. Of course, he did not plan for them to be go or raped, only to be controlled and killed. He left one of the girls, Marianne, handcuffed in the car and ordered the other girl, Anita, into the trunk. He then threatened Marianne in the back seat and attempted to suffocate her with a plastic bag. Frustrated that she was trying to escape, he then stabbed her in the back multiple times and slashed her throat. He then headed to the trunk and told the girl Marianne had gotten smart with me. He then told her that he needed her help because he had broken Marianne's nose, explaining the blood on his hands. Kemper says he lied to Anita because she was already going to die and did not need to know. I couldn't deal with telling her that, he says. This is when Kemper mindlessly began stabbing Anita, causing her to fall into the trunk. Ed slams the trunk closed and begins to panic as he feels the adrenaline set in. He stated that at this moment, he realizes he can't feel his keys in his back pocket, piecing together through all the adrenaline that he must have accidentally locked the keys in the trunk with Anita's dying body. Panic ensues further for Kemper as he stumbles over himself and begins to run away from the scene, tripping over his handgun. He states that he then stopped himself to collect his bearings so that he could assess the situation that he created for himself. He then finds his keys that were still in his pocket and picks up his handgun and begins to hide the bodies. This was the first 2 murders of the co-ed killer. Quote, "The first 24 hours were the 3 clear times where I could have been busted, and I wasn't." As you can see, the true motivation for Big Ed's killings was for control and power. He liked the fact that he was able to get away with the murders and enjoyed carrying them out as almost as a big FU to authorities like his mother and the police force, as he was right under their nose the entire time. It could be theorized that this was his psychopathic way of gaining some kind of peace in his twisted mind from the beratement in his childhood. You could say he even proved his mother right with his killing spree in a way no one could have expected. His killings for such a smart man was to prove to himself that the evils of the world could consume the weak, and so to challenge this belief, Edmund kills, thinking it would satisfy his hunger for control by kidnapping and commanding young girls to their death. Growing up, he viewed women as evil and manipulative because of his mother, only to become that very thing by kidnapping and killing any and all young girls to feed his bloodlust, manifesting his deepest, darkest fears, personifying his pure hatred for his mother into a traumatizing reality for those amongst the Santa Cruz area in the early 70s. Blaming his mother for creating something evil, only to prove her right for fearing the worst in the world. His capture. This will be the final concluding paragraph. In April of 1973, an officer came by Clarnell's home when Edmund Kemper was home. This is when the officer noticed many suspicious firearms in Edmund Kemper's place of residence, none of which correlate to the weapon he had recently been allowed to purchase at the time. Because of this, Edmund began to sweat as the officer grows more suspicious, given Kemper's history. This is when Kemper remembers the gun in question is in his car, and so he turns the officer around to hand him the correct firearm. The officer confiscated the weapon until the matter of its illegality could be resolved and bid him a farewell at the time. However, Edmund was shaken by the suspicious visit. And so, during another night of killing, Edmund Edmund attempts to stop himself from going through in a way of alluding to the fact that he was trying to save the girls' lives by not taking them to the place they wanted to go. Because if so, he would have taken them to the place of his first killing, and it would have been the perfect chance to kill again. And so he goes through with the ride, taking them to their dormitory rooms and settling on the thought of killing his mother instead, so that he could turn himself in. He premeditated this murder by planning to kill his mother's friend too, to make it seem that Clarnell and her friend had left on a spur-of-the-moment trip. He invited Clarnell's friend Sally Hallett by telephone, inviting her over for dinner and a movie. He would then go on to strangle Sally once she had arrived at 8 p.m., stuffing her body in the closet alongside with his mother, Clarnell, who he had bludgeoned and defiled the corpse of after she was killed the same day. Kemper left a note on his mother's corpse saying, approximately 5:15 a.m. Saturday, no need for her to suffer anymore at the hands of this horrible, murderous butcher. It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it. Not sloppy and incomplete, gents, just a lack of time. I've got things to do. Kemper left the house, and on Easter Sunday, he drove out of the town and dumped Hallett's car. After covering up the murder furthermore, he was pulled over for speeding and let off with a ticket. Kemper stated there was a weight lifted off his shoulders after he killed his mother. He would then be on the run, and at this point would be listening to the radio. Upon finding that there was no news on the murders, since the bodies were still undiscovered in the closet, he felt, quote-unquote, the original purpose was gone, and it wasn't serving any real or physical or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. And so at that moment, he decided to turn himself in. The first call he made to the police department in the middle of the night, feeling he couldn't wait until the morning. They thought he was lying or was some kind of nutcase, and so he had to call again in the morning and ask for an officer he knew from the jury room. It was at this point when two investigating officers arrived to arrest and convict Edmund Kemper for the murder of his mother, Clarnell Kemper, and friend Sally Hallett. He then confessed to the murders of 6 college co-eds. And on May 7th of 1973, Big Ed was indicted for all 8 murders and pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. On November 8th, 1973, Kemper was judged sane and sentenced guilty for all counts of murder. He was given 7 years to life for each count of murder to be served concurrently in prison, in which he remains today. As you can see, Edmund Kemper is definitely a force to be reckoned with. He was manipulative, he was evil, and he just wasn't a good guy, and he blamed it all on his mother, and he had a whole bunch of excuses for why he did these things, but really, he just enjoyed killing. He was a serial killer, and there's no way of denying that. He turned himself in. He just wanted to, like, he, even in his note, like, he was like, oh yeah, I have things to do, like, I have more killings to do, like, look at my art. Like, the serial killers have, like, this weird way of thinking, like, it's like, because they think about it all the time, so they think that, like, people will care the same way that they care, but it's an inhumane processing of things, obviously, because he was abused for years and years. And even when he had all the resources to be better, he fell back into this hostile environment, this toxic environment, because he actually enjoyed killing. It's really hard to deny that from all of his interviews. And he talks in such a, like, a monotonous tone, in such a, like, a calm way, like, as if, like, oh yeah, I'm proud of what he thinks he's proud. Like, we all see that, like, this guy is evil. And there are hundreds of people like him that are all over the place, and it's just truly a sad sight. There's Ed Gein, there is Hannibal Lecter, who's not even a real person, but he's, like, literally just the manifestation of, like, American serial killers. Like, that's sad that we have to create a book to reinforce an idea that's just so common. That's why we have to, like, it's just so sad. That's another thing. Handmaid's Tale. It's so sad that we have to make a book that teaches people of what a world that is close to becoming, what the world could be. And you can find these themes in the link down below. Alright, check me out, subscribe, like, and comment. See y'all next time.